Before the storm ever found its voice in Paris, France had already been humming with a quiet, relentless tension that seemed to live in its streets, in the ledgers of its tax collectors, in the heavy curtains of Versailles, and in the minds of millions who felt that history had somehow locked them into a life they had never chosen. The French Revolution did not begin with a single shout or a dramatic clash of swords. It began with hunger that lasted through winters, with debts that multiplied faster than harvests, and with a growing suspicion that the elaborate structure of society, so carefully described as natural and ordained, was in fact something constructed, fragile, and deeply unfair. France in the late 18th century was, on paper, the most dazzling kingdom in Europe. Its language defined diplomacy, its fashion set standards from Madrid to St. Petersburg, and its court at Versailles functioned like a living theater where power, wealth, and ritual moved in carefully choreographed patterns. Yet beneath the polished floors and gilded mirrors existed a system divided into three estates that did not share life equally. The first estate, the clergy, held immense influence over both spiritual and political life. The second estate, the nobility, enjoyed privileges that stretched across generations, including exemptions from many taxes. The third estate, which included everyone from wealthy merchants to urban laborers to peasants who worked the land, carried the overwhelming weight of taxation and responsibility. What made the situation explosive was not merely inequality itself, because inequality had existed for centuries without revolution. The difference now was awareness. The 18th century had produced thinkers who questioned long-accepted truths with an almost stubborn curiosity. Philosophers like Voltaire mocked blind authority with sharp wit. Rousseau imagined political legitimacy flowing from the general will of the people rather than divine right. Montesquieu analyzed the separation of powers as though government were a mechanism that could be engineered rather than inherited. Their ideas did not immediately overthrow anything, but they circulated through salons, pamphlets, whispered conversations, and coffee houses. Ideas have a peculiar patience. They can wait years before they find the conditions necessary to become action. Meanwhile, France's financial situation grew increasingly desperate. Years of warfare, including costly involvement in the American War of Independence, left the crown buried in debt. Ironically, France had helped support a colonial rebellion across the Atlantic that challenged monarchy and taxation without representation, and returning soldiers and officers brought back stories of assemblies, constitutions, and citizens who believed authority could be negotiated rather than obeyed. The monarchy's treasury, however, did not share in any philosophical excitement. It faced arithmetic that could not be ignored. King Louis XVI was not the caricature of cruelty often imagined in simplified retellings. He was hesitant, often indecisive, and burdened by a system he did not entirely control. Attempts at reform repeatedly collapsed because the privileged estates resisted losing exemptions that had defined their identity for generations. Ministers proposed tax changes, but entrenched interests blocked them. Each failure deepened the financial crisis. Each delay eroded confidence in the monarchy's competence. By the late 1780s, poor harvests worsened food shortages, pushing bread prices upward until they consumed the majority of a working family's income. Bread was not a luxury, it was survival. When bread became scarce or unaffordable, frustration turned quickly into anger. Urban crowds formed outside bakeries. Rumors spread faster than facts, and rumors in times of hunger rarely lean toward optimism. In 1788, faced with a financial breakdown, the king agreed to convene the Estates General, a representative assembly that had not met since 1614. The decision itself revealed how unusual the crisis had become. When representatives gathered in 1789, expectations were uneven. Many nobles believed they were restoring traditional consultation. Members of the Third Estate arrived with a very different vision. They carried notebooks of grievances compiled from across the kingdom, complaints about taxes, feudal dues, corruption, and the lack of political voice. The structure of the Estates General gave each estate one vote, regardless of population size. This meant the first and second estates could outvote the third estate, despite representing only a small fraction of the people. Frustration escalated quickly. Representatives of the third estate, many of them educated lawyers and professionals, began to question whether they were merely advisors or the legitimate voice of the nation itself. In June 1789, after being locked out of their meeting hall, whether intentionally or by logistical accident remains debated, they gathered in an indoor tennis court and swore what became known as the Tennis Court Oath. They pledged not to disperse until France had a constitution. It was an extraordinary moment, not because of violence, but because of its calm defiance. Authority was being redefined in real time. Paris watched events with mounting tension. The city was a place where political news and economic desperation mixed easily. When rumors spread that royal troops were moving to suppress the assembly, fear turned into action. On July 14, 1789, crowds stormed the Bastille, a medieval fortress prison that symbolized royal authority more than it held actual prisoners. The attack was chaotic, desperate, and deadly. The fall of the Bastille became less important for its military significance and more for its symbolic impact. The image of ordinary Parisians dismantling a royal fortress traveled across Europe with electrifying force. The revolution was no longer confined to political debate halls. It had entered the streets. In the countryside, peasants launched what became known as the Great Fear. Rumors of aristocratic plots to destroy crops or punish rebellious villages triggered widespread panic. Peasants attacked manor houses, destroyed records of feudal obligations, and demanded an end to centuries-old dues. Violence was uneven, but the psychological shift was unmistakable. The assumption that hierarchy was permanent began to dissolve. In August 1789, the National Assembly responded by abolishing many feudal privileges and issuing the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen. The document proclaimed liberty, equality before the law, and sovereignty residing with the nation. Its language was universal, almost poetic, declaring rights not as gifts from a monarch, but as inherent qualities of human existence. The Declaration inspired hope, but also introduced a tension that would persist. Ideals often moved faster than reality. Meanwhile, the royal family remained at Versailles, physically distant from the political upheaval. In October 1789, thousands of Parisian women, angered by bread shortages, marched to Versailles. Their journey was both practical and symbolic. They demanded food, accountability, and proximity between ruler and ruled. The march forced the king and his family to relocate to Paris, effectively placing the monarchy under the watch of the people. Revolutionary momentum did not move in a straight line. Early years included attempts to establish a constitutional monarchy. France experimented with redefining power without completely destroying traditional institutions. Yet trust between the king and the revolutionaries deteriorated. In 1791, Louis XVI attempted to flee Paris with his family in what became known as the Flight to Varennes. He was captured before reaching safety. The attempted escape shattered remaining confidence. A king who tried to abandon his own nation appeared less like a constitutional partner and more like a potential conspirator. Europe watched nervously. Monarchies across the continent feared revolutionary ideas spreading across borders. Foreign powers threatened intervention. In 1792, France declared war on Austria and Prussia. War intensified internal suspicion. Revolutionaries worried about traitors, spies, and counter-revolutionary plots. Political factions formed within the revolutionary government, each convinced that they alone represented the true spirit of the revolution. The monarchy was formally abolished in September 1792. France declared itself a republic.
Louis XVI was put on trial for treason. The proceedings were charged with symbolism. The former king, once considered sacred by tradition, now stood as citizen Louis Capet. In January 1793, he was executed by guillotine in a public square. The execution was both a political decision and a psychological rupture. A centuries-old institution had been severed with a single blade.
The revolution then entered one of its most controversial phases, known as the Reign of Terror. Led in large part by figures such as Maximilien Robespierre and the Committee of Public Safety, the government pursued what it defined as necessary vigilance. Revolutionary courts tried thousands accused of counter-revolutionary activity. Many were executed. The guillotine became both a tool and a symbol, present in public squares, efficient, terrifying, and impossible to ignore. The logic behind the terror was rooted in fear that the revolution could collapse under internal and external pressure. Supporters argued that harsh measures were temporary and essential. Critics saw it as a betrayal of the very rights proclaimed earlier. The revolution began devouring some of its own architects. Political alliances shifted rapidly. Yesterday's patriot could become today's suspect. Daily life during this period was marked by surveillance, denunciations, and a constant recalibration of loyalty. Language itself changed. Titles like citizen replaced older forms of address. The calendar was redesigned to break from religious tradition. Churches were repurposed or closed. Festivals celebrated abstract ideals like reason. The revolution attempted not only to change government, but to reinvent culture, time, and identity. Yet extremity often generates resistance. By 1794, fear of Robespierre's growing influence led to his arrest and execution. The Reign of Terror ended as abruptly as it had intensified. France transitioned into a more conservative phase under the Directory, a five-member executive body that struggled with corruption, economic instability, and ongoing war. The Directory years were marked by fatigue. After years of upheaval, many citizens longed less for ideological purity and more for stability. Political energy shifted toward practical concerns, food supply, security, and economic recovery. The revolution had dismantled old hierarchies, but had not yet constructed a system capable of consistent governance. Into this environment stepped a young military officer whose career had been accelerated by revolutionary turmoil, Napoleon Bonaparte. His successes on the battlefield made him both popular and politically useful. In 1799, through a coup known as the 18th Brumaire, Napoleon seized power, establishing the consulate and eventually declaring himself emperor. At first glance, the rise of an emperor might appear to contradict the revolution's goals, yet Napoleon preserved many revolutionary reforms, including legal equality under the Napoleonic Code. Feudal privileges did not return. Administrative systems were rationalized. The revolution's legacy became embedded not only in France, but across Europe through conquest and reform. The French Revolution's influence extended far beyond its immediate timeline. It demonstrated that a society structured for centuries around inherited privilege could be dismantled within a generation. It showed that ideas, when combined with economic crisis and political miscalculation, could produce rapid, unpredictable transformation. It also revealed that revolutions are rarely tidy narratives of progress. They contain hope and brutality, liberation and repression, vision and fear, often existing simultaneously. For ordinary people living through those years, the revolution was not an abstract chapter in history books. It was the difference between bread or hunger, between safety and suspicion, between anonymity and public accusation. A shopkeeper in Paris might wake to discover that currency had changed again. A peasant might find feudal dues abolished one year and new taxes imposed the next. A former noble might attempt to adapt to a world where titles carried no legal weight. Women played significant roles throughout the revolution, though they were often excluded from formal political rights. Market women initiated protests that altered national direction. Writers like Olympe de Gouges demanded recognition of women's rights, publishing the Declaration of the Rights of Woman and of the Female Citizen. Her activism ultimately led to her execution, illustrating both the possibilities and limits of revolutionary rhetoric. Religion, long intertwined with state authority, underwent dramatic transformation. Church lands were nationalized. Clergy were required to swear loyalty to the state. These measures fractured communities where faith had been central to daily life. Some embraced secularization as liberation from institutional control. Others viewed it as an assault on tradition and identity. The revolution also reshaped symbols. The tricolor flag, the Marseillaise anthem, and the imagery of liberty caps and broken chains created a new visual language. Public festivals attempted to replace royal ceremonies with celebrations of citizenship. Even measurement systems changed with the introduction of the metric system, an attempt to impose rational consistency on everyday transactions. Internationally, the revolution frightened ruling elites while inspiring reformers. Monarchies tightened control, fearing similar uprisings. Meanwhile, activists across Europe and beyond cited French events as proof that entrenched systems could be challenged. The revolution became both warning and beacon, depending on perspective. Economic consequences were uneven. Some merchants benefited from deregulation and confiscated lands. Others suffered from inflation and instability. Paper currency issued during the revolution fluctuated wildly in value. War economies shifted production priorities. Trade networks were disrupted. Culturally, the revolution encouraged new forms of political participation. Pamphlets, newspapers, and clubs became arenas for debate. Literacy gained political importance. Citizens were expected to understand, discuss, and defend policies. The idea that politics belonged only to elites lost credibility. Yet the emotional cost was immense. Families were divided by ideology. Public executions normalized spectacle. Trust became a scarce resource. Even after the most violent phases ended, memories lingered, shaping how subsequent generations understood authority and dissent. Historians continue to debate whether the revolution was inevitable. Some argue that structural inequality made upheaval unavoidable. Others suggest that different decisions by the monarchy might have allowed gradual reform. What remains clear is that the convergence of financial crisis, intellectual challenge, and social frustration created a moment when long-standing assumptions collapsed rapidly. The French Revolution did not produce a single stable outcome. Instead, it initiated a sequence of experiments: constitutional monarchy, republic, radical democracy, authoritarian consolidation, each attempting to define legitimacy in new terms. Its legacy is less a fixed destination and more a demonstration that political systems are constructed by human choices and can be reconstructed under pressure. In the centuries that followed, echoes of 1789 appeared in movements seeking independence, suffrage, and social reform. The vocabulary of rights became embedded in global discourse. At the same time, the revolution's darker chapters served as cautionary examples of how fear and ideological certainty can justify repression. Walking through modern Paris, one can still find physical reminders of those years: street names, monuments, museums, but the deeper legacy exists in concepts now taken for granted: citizenship defined by law rather than birth, equality before courts, the expectation that governments derive authority from the governed. The French Revolution began not with a single heroic figure, but with millions of individual calculations, whether to protest, to write, to march, to resist, to remain silent. It unfolded through moments of courage and moments of panic, through eloquent declarations and brutal enforcement. Its story resists simplification because it contains contradictions that mirror the complexities of any society attempting to reinvent itself.
From the first murmurs of dissatisfaction in overcrowded marketplaces to the thunder of artillery and revolutionary wars, the revolution traced a path that reshaped political imagination across continents. It remains a reminder that stability, however ancient it appears, rests on agreements that can be renegotiated when enough people decide that the existing order no longer serves them. Long before crowds gathered and blades fell, before banners were raised or oaths were sworn, France was already trembling in small, almost invisible ways. The trembling did not come from cannon fire or marching boots. It came from kitchens where bread was stretched thin, from account books filled with numbers that refused to balance, and from conversations that stopped abruptly whenever someone new entered the room. It came from the quiet realization, shared by millions yet spoken by few, that the world they lived in no longer made sense. France was not collapsing, it was decaying slowly, like wood eaten from the inside while the surface remained polished and impressive. To outsiders, the kingdom appeared powerful, cultured, refined. Its language shaped diplomacy, its artists defined elegance, its court dazzled Europe with ceremony and ritual so elaborate that it seemed eternal. But eternity is often an illusion maintained by habit, and habits can be broken. The structure of French society rested on an idea so old it felt natural, that people were born into fixed places, and that those places carried rights or burdens that could not be questioned. The clergy prayed and guided souls, the nobility governed and fought, everyone else worked, paid, endured. This arrangement was not merely enforced by law, it was reinforced by tradition, religion, and repetition. Most people had never imagined a different system, not because they loved this one, but because alternatives felt unimaginable.
What changed was not suffering itself, but interpretation. Hunger had existed before. Taxes had always been heavy. Inequality was nothing new. What was new was the growing sense that these conditions were not inevitable acts of God or fate, but the result of human choices, choices that benefited a few while exhausting many. In cities, especially Paris, words began to circulate differently. Books, pamphlets, and newspapers multiplied. Literacy was no longer confined to clergy and aristocrats. Ideas slipped through society like water through cracks. Philosophers questioned the logic of divine right. Writers mocked the absurdities of privilege. Thinkers proposed that authority could be justified only by consent, not birth. These ideas were dangerous not because they were violent, but because they were reasonable. Meanwhile, the state bled money. Wars had drained the treasury, and the cost of maintaining grandeur had become unbearable. The monarchy borrowed endlessly, postponing collapse through loans that grew heavier each year. Attempts to reform taxation failed again and again, blocked by those who benefited from exemption. Each failure hardened resentment. Each delay made the problem worse. By the late 1780s, weather turned against the people. Harvests failed. Bread prices soared. For families who already spent most of their income on food, this was not inconvenience, it was catastrophe. Hunger stripped patience away. When survival becomes uncertain, obedience loses its moral weight. The king, Louis XVI, was not a monster. He was something more tragic and more dangerous. Uncertain. He inherited a system he did not design and lacked the decisiveness to reshape. He hesitated where firmness was required and retreated where clarity might have saved him. His court remained insulated by ritual, mistaking ceremony for stability. When the Estates General was summoned, it felt less like a solution and more like an admission that something fundamental had gone wrong. Representatives arrived carrying notebooks filled with grievances, thousands of small injustices written down for the first time. These were not revolutionary manifestos, they were practical complaints, unfair taxes, corrupt officials, arbitrary power. But together they formed something explosive, evidence. What followed was not a single moment of rebellion, but a slow shift in perception. The Third Estate began to see itself not as a category within the system, but as the system itself. If they represented the overwhelming majority of the population, Why should their voice be equal to groups that numbered so few? The question alone altered reality. When they declared themselves a national assembly, they did not overthrow the state, they redefined it. Authority was no longer assumed to descend from a crown, it was claimed to rise from the people. That idea, once spoken aloud, could not be taken back.
Paris reacted not as an abstract political audience, but as a living, anxious body. Rumors raced through the streets. Fear and hope fed each other. When the Bastille fell, it was less an act of strategy than of emotion, a physical release of years of pressure. The fortress mattered because it stood for something older than itself. Its stones carried the weight of unchecked authority. Watching them fall felt like watching fear itself crack. After that, nothing returned to normal because normal no longer existed. In villages, peasants destroyed records of feudal obligations as if erasing ink could erase memory. In cities, citizens debated the meaning of liberty with an intensity usually reserved for religion. Symbols were invented, rituals discarded, language reshaped. People who had never been asked to think politically were suddenly expected to choose sides. The revolution did not march forward in a straight line. It lurched, paused, doubled back, and accelerated unexpectedly. Idealism collided with reality. Fear bred suspicion. Suspicion justified violence. The execution of the king did not end tyranny in a single stroke. It opened a void where certainty once stood. The terror did not arrive as madness. It arrived as logic taken too far. Surrounded by enemies, threatened from within and without, revolutionaries convinced themselves that survival required purity, and purity required elimination. Each execution made the next easier. Each justification became more abstract. Liberty was defended by removing liberty from those deemed dangerous. And yet, even in darkness, the revolution changed things that could not be undone. Titles lost meaning. Law began to matter more than lineage. Citizenship became an identity rather than a favor. The idea that people could remake their political world, for better or worse, had been proven true. When exhaustion finally replaced fervor, France did not return to what it had been. It could not. Too much had been seen. Too much had been destroyed. Into this exhaustion stepped order, ambition, and discipline in the form of Napoleon, who promised stability without surrendering all the revolution had achieved. The French Revolution did not end. It transformed. It echoed. It lingered in constitutions, protests, and political dreams across continents. It remains one of history's most unsettling lessons, that societies can endure injustice for centuries, but once belief collapses, change can arrive with terrifying speed. France did not wake up one morning and decide to change the world. The French Revolution did not begin with a declaration, a riot, or a guillotine. It began with something far quieter and far more dangerous, a loss of faith in the way things were supposed to work. For generations, life in France had followed a rhythm that few questioned. You were born into a place, and that place shaped the rest of your existence. Your work, your obligations, even your expectations were inherited like a surname. The system was old, heavy, and deeply unequal, but it was familiar. Familiarity has a strange power. It can make injustice feel normal, even necessary. What unraveled this order was not sudden misery, but accumulated strain. Like a rope pulled tighter each year, France stretched itself toward a breaking point that few could see clearly, but many could feel. The countryside groaned under taxes that rose regardless of harvests. Cities swelled with people chasing work that barely sustained them. Bread, the simplest foundation of daily life, became both symbol and threat. When bread was plentiful, society held together. When it vanished, so did patience. At the top of this strained world stood a monarchy wrapped in ritual. Versailles glittered like a separate universe, insulated by distance and etiquette. The court spoke a language of ceremony, while the nation spoke a language of survival. These two languages no longer translated. Louis XVI inherited a crown already cracked by debt and contradiction. He was not cruel by nature, but indecision can be as destructive as brutality. He wanted to rule well, without ruling differently. He wanted reform without conflict. History rarely rewards that kind of wish. Each attempt to fix the kingdom's finances collapsed under resistance from those who feared losing privilege. Each failure made the crown look weaker, not kinder. Meanwhile, ideas slipped beyond control. The Enlightenment did not shout from rooftops, it whispered into salons, classrooms, and private letters. It suggested that power could be examined, that authority could be questioned, that obedience required justification. These ideas did not call for blood, they called for reason, and reason, once invited in, does not leave quietly. France's involvement in the American War of Independence added irony to instability. French resources helped another society overthrow distant authority in the name of representation and rights. Soldiers returned home having witnessed something unsettling, a government built, argued over, and defended by citizens who did not kneel to kings. That example did not cause the revolution, but it sharpened the contrast between what existed and what seemed possible. By the late 1780s, crisis was no longer abstract. Weather destroyed crops, food prices surged, families who had lived on the edge for decades fell into desperation. Hunger strips away political patience. When survival is uncertain, ideology becomes immediate. The decision to convene the Estates General was meant to stabilize the kingdom. Instead, it exposed how deeply divided France had become. Representatives arrived with lists of grievances that read less like rebellion and more like accumulated exhaustion. These were not dreams of overthrow, they were demands to be heard. But the structure of the Estates General itself revealed the problem. Equality was discussed, but not practiced. The majority was asked to accept minority rule again. This time, it refused.
When the Third Estate declared itself the National Assembly, it crossed an invisible line. It did not seize power with weapons, it claimed legitimacy with words. The idea that sovereignty belonged to the nation rather than the crown reshaped reality without firing a shot. That moment mattered not because it destroyed something old, but because it created something new. Paris felt this shift immediately. The city became a pressure chamber of rumor, fear, hope, and anger. When the Bastille fell, it was not a calculated military victory, it was a psychological one. The fortress represented arbitrary authority, and its collapse suggested that authority could be dismantled by collective will. After that, momentum outran intention. In the countryside, peasants attacked symbols of feudal control. Records burned, obligations dissolved in smoke. The old order unraveled faster than anyone had planned. Laws struggled to keep pace with belief. The Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen attempted to capture the revolution's spirit in words that sounded eternal. Liberty, equality, sovereignty of the people. These were powerful claims, and power attracts resistance. The Declaration promised universality, but reality lagged behind ideals. The king's forced relocation to Paris changed the monarchy's role from ruler to captive symbol. Trust eroded further when Louis attempted to flee. A king who ran confirmed fears more effectively than any pamphlet. After that, compromise became nearly impossible. War with neighboring monarchies intensified paranoia. The revolution felt surrounded. Fear sharpened judgment.
Political factions hardened. Suspicion became policy. The execution of the king marked a point of no return. The revolution severed its last tie to the past, but in doing so, it entered uncharted territory. Without a crown to oppose, revolutionaries turned inward, defining enemies not by birth, but by belief. The terror did not emerge from chaos alone. It emerged from certainty, the certainty that survival justified extremes. The guillotine became a solution to fear, applied with chilling efficiency. Each execution was framed as protection. Each protection expanded the definition of threat. Daily life shrank under surveillance. Words mattered too much. Silence could be suspicious. Loyalty became performative. The revolution demanded not only obedience, but enthusiasm. And yet, beneath the violence, irreversible change continued. Feudalism did not return. Legal equality advanced. The metric system reorganized reality itself. Even time was redesigned. The revolution attempted to rebuild not just government, but thought. When Robespierre fell, it was less a moral awakening than exhaustion. France was tired of fear. The Directory that followed promised stability but delivered fragility. Corruption thrived. Confidence faded. From this instability rose Napoleon, not as a betrayal of the revolution, but as its unintended consequence. He offered order without restoring the old hierarchy. The revolution had destroyed permanence. Napoleon repackaged it.
The French Revolution did not end cleanly. It dissolved into legacy. Its ideas crossed borders. Its warnings echoed through centuries. It proved that societies can tolerate injustice for generations, but once belief collapses, transformation becomes unstoppable. France did not collapse in a single moment. It unraveled thread by thread until the pattern that had governed life for centuries no longer held its shape. Long before crowds filled the streets, before oaths echoed in stone halls or metal met bone, there existed a quiet contradiction at the heart of the kingdom. The state demanded loyalty while offering no convincing reason for it to continue. For most people, life was narrow and repetitive. Seasons mattered more than politics. A good harvest meant survival. A bad one meant debt, hunger, and silence. The land remembered every footstep, every unpaid tax, every obligation inherited from ancestors long gone. None of this was new. What was new was the sensation that endurance itself had become pointless. Suffering had lost its narrative. It no longer promised reward in heaven or stability on earth. It simply accumulated. At the other end of society stood a world that obeyed entirely different laws. In palaces saturated with ceremony, power disguised itself as tradition. The rituals were elaborate not because they were necessary, but because repetition gave them authority. When something is done long enough, it begins to feel inevitable. Versailles functioned like a machine designed to transform inequality into elegance. It did not hide excess, it aestheticized it. Louis XVI inherited this machine without understanding how fragile it had become. He was raised to preserve, not to reinvent. His education taught obedience to precedent, respect for hierarchy, and caution above all. In a time that demanded decisiveness, he hesitated. In a moment that required imagination, he relied on habit. The monarchy did not fall because it was evil. It fell because it could not adapt fast enough to survive its own contradictions. Money exposed everything. War, especially distant war fought for abstract alliances, drained resources faster than the state could replace them. The treasury became a ledger of postponed consequences. Each loan delayed collapse, but deepened dependence. Reform was proposed again and again, and each time blocked by those whose privilege depended on the system remaining untouched. The result was paralysis disguised as governance. While the state froze, thought moved freely.
Ideas do not require permission. They seep into conversation, reshape expectations, and alter how people interpret their own experience. Writers questioned why birth determined destiny. Philosophers asked whether obedience required consent. These were not revolutionary slogans at first, they were questions, and questions are more dangerous than answers because they invite participation.
Paris became an amplifier. In its narrow streets and crowded markets, news and rumor intertwined. Words moved faster than authority. When food prices rose, they carried meaning beyond economics. Bread became a measure of justice. If the state could not guarantee the most basic necessity of life, what claim did it have to obedience? The calling of the Estates General was meant to stabilize the situation. Instead, it revealed how far reality had drifted from the myth of unity. Representatives arrived with grievances that exposed a kingdom fractured by resentment. The Third Estate, representing the overwhelming majority, quickly realized that their numerical strength meant nothing within a structure designed to contain them. That realization changed everything. When they declared themselves the nation, it was not an act of arrogance. It was a recognition of fact. Sovereignty shifted not through force, but through definition. Once authority was claimed in the name of the people, the crown became a symbol rather than a source. The storming of the Bastille did not happen because it was strategically vital. It happened because it stood as a physical reminder of arbitrary power. Its fall mattered because it transformed fear into action. The people did not simply protest, they discovered their capacity to act collectively. From that point forward, events accelerated beyond control. In the countryside, fear took on its own logic. Rumors of retaliation sparked preemptive violence. Old obligations were erased by fire. The past was not negotiated, it was destroyed. In the cities, political participation expanded rapidly, sometimes faster than understanding could follow. Clubs formed, pamphlets multiplied, language itself evolved to match new realities. The Declaration of Rights attempted to anchor the revolution in universal principles. It spoke in absolutes, liberty, equality, law. But absolutes collide with fear, and fear was everywhere. Foreign threats loomed, internal dissent sharpened. Loyalty became a matter of survival rather than belief. The monarchy's final collapse was less dramatic than inevitable. The attempted escape confirmed what many already suspected, that trust had evaporated. When the king was executed, the act carried symbolic weight far beyond the individual. It marked the end of inherited authority as a moral foundation. What followed was not chaos alone, but an obsession with control. The terror emerged from the belief that the revolution could be purified through vigilance. Violence became procedural, death became administrative. Each execution was justified as prevention. Fear became policy. Everyday life shrank under scrutiny. Speech became performance. Neutrality vanished. To exist was to declare allegiance, and allegiance had to be proven repeatedly. The revolution consumed not only enemies, but uncertainty itself. And yet, even in its most brutal moments, the revolution permanently altered the structure of society. Legal equality replaced feudal hierarchy. Citizenship became a status defined by law rather than lineage. Systems of measurement, administration, and justice were redesigned to reflect rational order rather than tradition. When the terror ended, it did so not through moral clarity, but exhaustion. France wanted stability more than purity. The Directory promised moderation, but delivered fragility. Corruption filled the vacuum left by ideology. Out of this instability emerged a figure shaped by the revolution's contradictions. Napoleon did not restore the old order, he organized the new one. He transformed revolutionary chaos into imperial structure, preserving legal reforms while reintroducing centralized authority.
The revolution had destroyed permanence. Napoleon repackaged it. The French Revolution was not a clean break from the past. It was a violent negotiation between what had been and what might be. It proved that societies can survive injustice for centuries, but once belief collapses, change becomes unstoppable and uncontrollable. If someone had walked across France in the years just before the revolution, they would not have seen flames or armies or banners demanding change. They would have seen fields, workshops, bakeries, churches, roads filled with carts, and people whose lives seemed locked into familiar patterns. On the surface, everything still functioned. Bells rang on schedule, markets opened at dawn, taxes were collected, soldiers drilled, kings ruled. But beneath this ordinary rhythm, something subtle and dangerous had begun to spread. Not rebellion, not yet, but doubt. For centuries, French society rested on a structure that felt as permanent as the land itself. The clergy prayed and interpreted divine will. The nobility governed, owned land, and carried inherited honor like a second skin. Everyone else, from merchants to peasants, existed within a broad, undefined mass that sustained the entire kingdom through labor and payment. This arrangement had survived wars, plagues, and dynastic changes because it was reinforced by habit as much as by law. People did not necessarily approve of it, but they understood it. What changed in the late 18th century was not the existence of hardship, but the meaning attached to it. Hunger, taxation, and inequality had always existed. Now, however, they began to feel unnecessary. Conversations shifted from acceptance to questioning. Why should some never pay taxes? Why should birth determine opportunity? Why should authority remain unquestioned simply because it had always existed? These questions did not originate in the streets first. They emerged in writing, in debate, in private gatherings where ideas could be tested without immediate consequence. Philosophers challenged long-held assumptions with unsettling calm. They wrote as if society were not sacred but constructed. If it was constructed, then it could be altered. At the same time, France's government faced a problem that ideas alone could not solve: money. War had drained the treasury repeatedly, and the crown relied on borrowing to survive. Debt multiplied faster than revenue. Attempts to reform taxation met resistance from privileged groups who had little incentive to change a system that protected them.
The monarchy, embodied in Louis XVI, stood at the center of this contradiction. He was not a tyrant in the theatrical sense. He did not delight in cruelty or chaos. Instead, he hesitated, postponed decisions, and trusted that gradual adjustments might restore balance. Unfortunately, the crisis demanded speed, clarity, and risk. His reluctance made every reform attempt weaker. Meanwhile, harvest failures struck at the worst possible time. Grain shortages pushed bread prices upward. For ordinary families, bread was not merely food, it was the foundation of survival. When the cost of bread rose beyond reach, frustration spread rapidly. Hunger changes the way people interpret authority. A government that cannot guarantee food begins to look illegitimate. The decision to summon the Estates General was meant as a solution, but it exposed deeper fractures. Representatives arrived carrying lists of grievances that revealed how differently each estate experienced the kingdom. The Third Estate quickly realized that despite representing the majority, they possessed no structural advantage. Their frustration evolved into determination. When they declared themselves the National Assembly, they did something radical without drawing a weapon. They redefined legitimacy. Authority no longer flowed automatically from the crown. It could be claimed by those who represented the nation. This shift in perception electrified Paris. The city became a chamber where tension amplified itself. Rumors moved faster than facts. When news spread the troops might suppress the assembly, fear turned into action. Crowds gathered, armed themselves, and eventually marched toward the Bastille. The Bastille itself held few prisoners,
But its symbolism outweighed its function. It represented arbitrary imprisonment, royal control, and centuries of unquestioned authority. Its fall was chaotic, violent, and emotionally charged. When its gates were breached, something psychological broke along with the stone. Across the countryside, panic spread through rumor. Villages feared retaliation from nobles. Peasants attacked estates, destroyed records, and attempted to erase obligations that had defined rural life for generations. The old order began dissolving not through legislation alone, but through collective action. The National Assembly responded by abolishing many feudal privileges and issuing a declaration asserting universal rights. The language was bold, almost poetic. It promised liberty, equality before law, and representation. For the first time, authority was framed as something granted by the people rather than inherited. Yet ideals move faster than reality. Economic instability continued. Suspicion deepened. The royal family's distance from Paris created tension. When crowds marched to Versailles demanding bread and accountability, they forced the monarchy to relocate. The king now lived under public scrutiny.
Trust eroded further when Louis attempted to escape. His capture confirmed fears that he might oppose the revolution. After that moment, compromise became increasingly unlikely. External threats intensified internal paranoia. Neighboring monarchies feared revolutionary ideas spreading. War erupted. In wartime, dissent becomes dangerous. Political factions within France competed to define loyalty. The monarchy was abolished. The Republic declared. Louis XVI was tried and executed. The act severed centuries of tradition with one irreversible decision. What followed was not peace, but escalation. The revolution entered a phase driven by fear of betrayal. The Committee of Public Safety pursued enemies with relentless efficiency. Trials became rapid, executions frequent. The guillotine stood as both instrument and warning. Daily existence transformed. Citizens monitored speech carefully. Allegiance required constant demonstration. Even revolutionary leaders became targets. Suspicion fed itself. Despite violence, structural change advanced. Legal equality replaced feudal hierarchy. Administrative systems were reorganized. The calendar and measurement systems were redesigned to reflect rational principles. Eventually, the intensity of the terror produced backlash. Its architects fell. France shifted toward moderation under the Directory, though instability persisted. Amid corruption and fatigue, a military leader gained prominence. Napoleon Bonaparte's success on the battlefield translated into political power. Through a coup, he reshaped government while preserving key revolutionary reforms. The revolution's legacy extended far beyond its timeline. It demonstrated that authority could be challenged, that inherited privilege could be dismantled, and that ideas could reshape entire nations. What began as doubt evolved into transformation. The French Revolution was not a single event, but a chain reaction, a sequence of decisions, fears, hopes, and actions that permanently altered how societies understood power.